I'm George Packer. I am a fellow New Yorker. That's my latest book, The Unwinding, An Inner History of the New America. And I'm on the staff of the New Yorker magazine, where I've been a staff writer for 10 years. And it's great to be in heaven at Google. I was on the West Coast version of heaven a few weeks ago. So forgive me if I say a few of the things that I said out in San Francisco. But I'm going to leave a lot of time for questions. And because you're New Yorkers and not San Franciscans, I don't expect you to be as polite as they were out there. So The Unwinding is a book about the past generation of American life, really from the late 70s up to the present, and some of the big changes that have passed through the country and changed people's lives. It's really a book about how certain institutions that used to work on behalf of the majority of Americans, sort of supporting the aspirations of middle-class Americans, from schools, government, corporations, to the media, have eroded, and how the idea of a kind of cohesive society has begun to fall apart. And how the deal that used to exist among Americans, which said that if you worked hard and if you educated your children, that not only would you have a secure place and they might have an even better one, but you would have recognition in society. There'd be a place at the table for you. And although that deal left out a lot of Americans, it had within it the tools to correct those injustices and to include more. And over the past generation, that deal, which you could call the social contract, has frayed to the breaking point, so that more and more we are a country of winners and losers. We are both more free and less equal than a generation ago. We are more inclusive and more stratified. Those two things have been happening at the same time. These are not unfamiliar themes, and in fact, you've probably heard of a lot of books that deal with issues like income inequality, globalization, the effect of the information revolution on society, the decline of the middle class, political polarization, the rise of both organized money in Washington and also an organized right wing in Washington. All of those are themes of The Unwinding. But they're not talked about explicitly, because this is not another policy book. It's not another 10 things that are wrong with America and 10 ways to fix them. I don't have a prescription, so don't ask me for one. What this is closer to is a novel. It reads like a big, panoramic, but also quite intimate novel about American life over the past generation, except that all of it had to clear fact-checking. It's all true. But it has the texture and the focus on individual lives that you expect from a novel. And I hope it has the narrative power and the pull of a novel that makes you want to know what happens next and what's going to happen to these characters and how are they going to recover from the latest setback in their lives. So I'm going to read from the very short prologue, which will give you a feel for the language of the book and for the scope of the book. And then I'll introduce some of the characters a bit, and then we should spend most of the time having a conversation. No one can say when the unwinding began, when the coil that held Americans together in its secure and sometimes stifling grip first gave way. Like any great change, the unwinding began at countless times, in countless ways. And at some moment, the country, always the same country, crossed a line of history and became irretrievably different. If you were born around 1960 or afterward, you've spent your adult life in the vertigo of that unwinding. You watched structures that had been in place before your birth collapse like pillars of salt across the vast visible landscape, the farms of the Carolina Piedmont, the factories of the Mahoning Valley, Florida subdivisions, California schools, and other things harder to see but no less vital in supporting the order of everyday life, changed beyond recognition. Ways and means in Washington caucus rooms, taboos on New York trading desks, manners and morals everywhere. When the norms that made the old institutions useful began to unwind, and the leaders abandoned their posts, the Roosevelt Republic that had reigned for almost half a century came undone. The void was filled by the default force in American life, organized money. The unwinding is nothing new. There have been unwindings every generation or two. The fall to earth of the founders' heavenly republic in a noisy marketplace of quarrelsome factions. The war that tore the United States apart and turned them from plural to singular. The crash that laid waste to the business of America, making way for a democracy of bureaucrats and everymen. Each decline brought renewal. Each implosion released energy. Out of each unwinding came a new cohesion. The unwinding brings freedom, more than the world has ever granted, and to more kinds of people than ever before. Freedom to go away, freedom to return, freedom to change your story, get your facts, get hired, get fired, get high, marry, divorce, go broke, begin again, start a business, have it both ways, take it to the limit, walk away from the ruins, succeed beyond your dreams and boast about it, fail abjectly and try again. And with freedom, the unwinding brings its illusions, for all these pursuits are as fragile as thought balloons popping against circumstances. Winning and losing are all American games. And in the unwinding, winners win bigger than ever, floating away like bloated dirigibles. And losers have a long way to fall before they hit bottom, and sometimes they never do. This much freedom leaves you on your own. More Americans than ever before live alone, but even a family can exist in isolation, just managing to survive in the shadow of a huge military base without a soul to lend a hand. A shiny new community can spring up overnight, miles from anywhere, then fade away just as fast. An old city can lose its industrial foundation and 2/3 of its people, while all its mainstays, churches, government, businesses, charities, unions, fall like building flats in a strong wind, hardly making a sound. Alone on a landscape, without solid structures, Americans have to improvise their own destinies, plot their own stories of success and salvation. A North Carolina boy clutching a Bible in the sunlight grows up to receive a new vision of how the countryside could be resurrected. A young man goes to Washington and spends the rest of his career trying to recall the idea that drew him there in the first place. An Ohio girl has to hold her life together as everything around her falls apart until, in middle age, she finally seizes the chance to do more than survive. As these obscure Americans find their way in the unwinding, they pass alongside new monuments where the old institutions once stood. The outsized lives of their most famous countrymen, celebrities who only grow more exalted as other things recede. These icons sometimes occupy the personal place of household gods, and they offer themselves as answers to the riddle of how to live a good or better life. In the unwinding, everything changes and nothing lasts, except for the voices, American voices. Open, sentimental, angry, matter of fact, inflected with borrowed ideas, God, TV, and the dimly remembered past, telling a joke above the noise of the assembly line, complaining behind window shades drawn against the world, thundering justice to a crowded park or an empty chamber, closing a deal on the phone, dreaming aloud late at night on a front porch as trucks rush by in the darkness. So that prologue gives you a map of the entire book. It introduces you to all the key people and places that you're going to meet. And what I wanted to do was to combine the very obscure people you've never heard of and would be unlikely to hear of if not for reading about them, to the most famous people in the country. From Tammy Thomas, who was the Ohio girl growing up in Youngstown amid the collapse of the steel industry and the collapse of the city, trying to survive and raise 3 children on one of the last good assembly line jobs left, to Newt Gingrich, who stands, I think, more than any other politician for the toxic atmosphere of demonization that we've come to expect is normal in our politics. From Jeff Connaughton, who's the Washington guy, who arrives there full of idealism and becomes an aide to a young senator named Joe Biden, thinking he will ride Biden's charisma into the White House, and then gradually becomes disillusioned and ends up becoming a lobbyist and passing through that revolving door that so many people in Washington do, makes a lot of money, loses a lot of money in the financial crisis, which is sort of the critical moment, the reckoning for almost all the characters in the book, and decides to go back into government one last time as the chief of staff to Biden's successor, Ted Kaufman, in order to try to make Wall Street pay for what it did in the financial crisis. From him to Alice Waters, the food evangelist of local cuisine and organic food. From Peter Thiel, whom you probably know is the founder of PayPal and the first outside investor in Facebook, and a libertarian philosopher of sorts in his own right, to Jay-Z, who, as much as anyone, sort of represents the culture of coming from nowhere to the top and what it says about celebrity today. So you move between people you don't know and the most famous. You also move between the power centers, Washington, Wall Street, Silicon Valley, and some of the forgotten parts of the country, such as the textile and tobacco region of North Carolina, where you meet a man named Dean Price, who is the son of tobacco farmers. His father was a failed fire and brimstone preacher who eventually took his own life. And Dean grew up in the shadow of his father's failure, determined to become independent and to make his own way as an entrepreneur. And Dean set up a chain of truck stops and fast food restaurants along a stretch of US 220 between Greensboro, North Carolina, and Martinsville, Virginia. And for a while, he was making a go of it, selling gas and fried chicken, until he realized that Walmart up the hill on the interstate or on the state road and Sheetz Oil next door with low-cost gasoline were squeezing him so that he couldn't compete. The word he used was hog-tied. The multinationals had him hog-tied. And meanwhile, the economy of the region was plummeting so that people were more and more dependent on Walmart for everything that they needed. So in the middle of his career, with his chain of truck stops beginning to topple with the financial crisis, Dean Price, who in an unconventional way is a very religious man and who sees his life as a kind of a quest, had an epiphany. And that epiphany was he needed to get away from this model of selling imported oil and fast food. He needed to move into alternative energy, into biodiesel, and that the source of it was all around him, these fallow tobacco farms that could be used to grow canola, and out of canola oil could come biodiesel. All the fast food and barbecue joints around him that threw out their waste oil at the end of the night, that waste oil could be used to make biodiesel. So at the passage I'm going to read now, Dean is just on the cusp of this epiphany of moving out of his old business into this new one. Still an entrepreneur, but with a vision of not just how he could make a fortune, but how he could remake the countryside, which had fallen on these hard times. The landscape Dean had returned to, where he planned to live out his life, was very old and also new, as particular as anything in America, and also as generic, as beautiful and as ugly. In his imagination, it had become a nightmare, so profoundly wrong that he called it sinful. And he hated the sin more than any casual visitor or distant critic possibly could. Yet he also saw here a dream of redemption so unlikely and glorious that it could only fill the mind's eye of a visionary native son. Once, driving through Cleveland County, Dean happened to pass the Hardshell Baptist Church that his father had once tried to get, but failed, the failure that had broken his father's will. Dean had gone down with him to Cleveland County and heard the sermon that his father had given for his audition back around 1975, so that decades later, he recognized the church. And he also noticed that there was now a fucking Bojangles right next door. For Dean, Bojangles had come to represent everything that was wrong with the way Americans lived. How they raised their food and transported it across the country, how they grew the crops to feed the animals they ate, the way they employed the people who worked in the restaurants, the way the money left the community. Everything about it was wrong. Dean's own business, gas and fast food, had become hateful to him, and he saw the error of his ways as his father never had. And the conjunction of his father's legacy and his own struck him with bitter irony as he drove past. He was seeing beyond the surfaces of the land to its hidden truths. Some nights, he sat up late on his front porch with a glass of Jack and listened to the trucks heading south on 220, carrying crates of live chickens to the slaughterhouses, always under cover of darkness, like a vast and shameful trafficking. Chickens pumped full of hormones that left them too big to walk. And he thought how these same chickens might return from their destination as pieces of meat to his floodlit Bojangles up the hill from his house. And that meat would be drowned in the bubbling fryers by employees whose hatred of the job would leak into the cooked food. And that food would be served up and eaten by customers who would grow obese and end up in the hospital in Greensboro with diabetes or heart failure, a burden to the public. And later, Dean would see them riding around the Mayodan Walmart in electric carts because they were too heavy to walk the aisles of a supercenter, just like hormone-fed chickens. Somehow in North Carolina, that passage got a big laugh. Maybe not in Google, New York. Dean's story, the story of Tammy Thomas in Youngstown, Jeff Connaughton in Washington, Peter Thiel in Silicon Valley, are the backbone of the narrative. And you move between them as their lives move from the late 70s to the present. And as you also meet the VIPs, the celebrities who cast a different light on the big events and trends of the period. And I hope that the overall feeling is not completely one of darkness and despair. I've been accused of peddling a pessimistic message here. But when you know someone like Dean Price or Tammy Thomas, when you listen to Peter Thiel talk about the future, when you see someone like Jeff Connaughton coming back to try to right the wrongs of Washington, it's very hard to be completely pessimistic about America. I get pessimistic when I think about the big picture. Like the 10 things wrong with America and how to fix them. When I think about Washington and Wall Street. But when I'm writing about these individuals, there's a certain resilience and a resourcefulness in them, a refusal to quit that might be particularly American, and that tells me there are still people who have an investment in what used to be called the American dream. So that's the unwinding, and now I am happy to try to answer whatever questions you might have.
Hi.
Hi.
So one of the things that your prologue was making me think about was the connection between sort of the breakdown of community structures and the lack of money caused by the financial collapse. Our CEO, Eric Schmidt, one thing that he's said from time to time is more money solves all known problems. So,
all known problems.
Yes.
Right.
Don't necessarily agree. But do you think without the financial collapse, do you think this breakdown of community would still be going on? Do you think it was just unmasked by the financial collapse, or do you think it was brought about by the financial collapse?
I think it was unmasked by it. That's why my book begins in 1978. My guess is most people in this room were not born in 1978. I was a teenager. It seemed like a dreary, formless, impossible to define kind of dismal time. Jimmy Carter was in the White House. The big song, was the Bee Gees from Saturday Night Fever. And yet, looking back, that was a key moment. Several things were happening at once. And so, to answer your question, it's been a generation-long development that the financial crisis accelerated, brought out into the open, but didn't cause. Deindustrialization really began to take off. Tammy Thomas's story from Youngstown is about what happened when the steel mills started shutting in the late 70s. The rise of the personal computer, the Apple II in 1977 was like the beginning of really the popularization of computers, which led to what you do. And big money coming to Washington began around 78 with lobbying as a major force. So did the rise of the new right. Gingrich came to Washington in 78. That's one reason why he's profiled in the book, with a purpose not to build up the institution of Congress, but to tear it down. And out of the rubble, to build his own base of power and the power of the conservative movement. So what you see is the beginning not of building institutions, but of kind of tearing them down. And you see the physical results in towns all over the country, but you also see the social results in the lack of structures that people can count on. One thing we might talk about is whether the structure called the internet is beginning to replace those old social structures, and we can discuss that. But I think you were getting at something with your question. And if so, I agree with you that this has been something much longer than just a 5-year process, as you will find out if you ask anyone from the Midwest or from rural North Carolina.
Thanks.
Yes?
You alluded to the public school system in California, but my sense was that while California may be the worst of it, the public school system all over the country has degraded since the 70s. Why pick on California, and what do you have to say about the public school system in the U.S. overall over the last few decades?
Well, I'm picking on California because I'm a product of the California public school system. And I graduated, again, in that key year of 1978. Maybe I've started the book then because I think everything began the year I got out of high school. But in fact, that was also the year of Proposition 13, which was the first big shot fired in the tax revolt, and which initiated a wave of anti-tax initiatives across the country. And in California, the results were almost immediate and devastating. It went from being the best public school system in the country, and then over the following decades to being down there close to Mississippi. Now, there are other reasons, too. There are social reasons. There's reasons of poverty, of how people raise their children, of family structure. But without the funding, and I know this because my son goes to public school here in New York, and I have to bring in the paper towels at the start of the year. When I was in school, the parents did not have to bring in the paper towels. So there's been a starving of resources of public schools across the country, which is maybe what you're getting at. But California is the most egregious case, so they deserve to be picked on. Yes?
One of the reasons that I'm excited about your book is that when the folks that I know in Silicon Valley and myself talk about the institutions that you're talking about them in a very technocratic way. When we talk about government, we talk about externalities and nudges and things like that.
Right.
And certainly in your book, and it seems like the characters that you're talking about, there's sort of the VIPs and then there's the rest. It seems like there's a thread that these things have some sort of moral significance. And I was wondering if you could talk about that distinction.
That's a great way to put it. You're absolutely right. I mean, institutions are complicated things, and they're made up of rules, of traditions and precedents, of the technical ways in which they function, but also of deals between people and of people's attitudes toward each other and what corners they're willing to cut and how much they're willing to get away with. And one of the things that's happened over the past generation is our leaders have been willing to get away with more and more. And the taboos and sort of social stigmas have dropped away. And once that happens, it's hard to put them back because People don't want to be the sucker at the table. So there is, I wrote a piece that maybe some of you saw in the New Yorker about the political culture of Silicon Valley, and I was interested that there seems to be more and more interest in government in Silicon Valley. And one expression of that is an idea of using technology as a model for how government can be organized and how to fix what's wrong with government, so that we have new apps that are there really more for citizens to use in order to interact with government and to improve the way it works. I have nothing against those. I think they're all good steps. I just don't want to overhype them, because government really comes down to power and resources and conflicts of interests and conflicts of values, which are don't really yield to technological fixes. It has an engineering component, but it also has a moral and a social component. Issues of justice and fairness can't be solved by computers. So although I'm interested in Citizenville, I don't look to it for all the answers. Yes?
In your introduction, you talk about the unwinding and subsequent renewals throughout American history. Given that you've studied the unwinding, what are you seeing as being what could potentially be the renewal?
There's several models that I've seen out there, and I'll talk about them, and then I'll tell you why I don't see in any of them a really convincing long-term solution. One is localism, which is to say Washington does not have the answers. It's just a paralyzed place, and it is. I was just there a week ago on my book tour, and as soon as I got out at Union Station, I just felt this heaviness settle over me, like this is not where things get fixed. This is where problems are made. So it's become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Do you remember Ronald Reagan's first inaugural address? He famously said, government is not the solution to our problems. Government is the problem. By saying that, he guaranteed that it would be true. And it's become true. Because there are a lot of people in Washington who want to see government fail. Imagine if you had people at the head of tech companies who wanted to see technology fail. It would fail. So in response to that, there's a sense among people, including people like Dean Price in North Carolina, that they have to find answers where they are for the problems that they have. And one thing I really admire about both Dean and Tammy Thomas in Youngstown is they have not left. They've stuck it out in these hard-pressed areas and kind of improvised answers. For Dean, the answer to the failure of tobacco is not tobacco or a cash crop. It's to use the land to revitalize the land, doing something that needs to be done, which is to create fuel in order to get us off foreign oil and off our dependence on it. So that holds some promise, I think, for North Carolina. But is localism multiplied across the country going to solve these bigger institutional erosions? I'm skeptical, because we're just too complex a society. We're too intertwined. We're too interconnected, and not just by technology. For every little region to have its own Dean Price as an entrepreneur with an idea, it's a good thing, but it isn't. It doesn't have, to me, the makings of something that can really rebind the country in the way that, say, the New Deal did after the Wall Street crash. And another model is the internet. There's some writers like Stephen Johnson who hold the internet up, and the concept of peer networks, of breaking down hierarchies and establishing connections with people across different groups by virtue of something like Kickstarter, something like Wikipedia, something like a new currency that don't rely on centralized models and on government structures, but are more happening in civil society and happening through technology. And there too, Peter Thiel is in my book because although he's a tech billionaire and one of the most successful tech investors in the world, he asks the skeptical questions that need to be asked, and that should be asked above all at a place like this. how much of a change are we really making? How broad is it? Why is it that the 35 years from the Apple II to the present, to the apotheosis of Google and Facebook, have also been 35 years of middle-class decline? Is there a relation between those two phenomena? Are they independent? These to me are key questions, and questions that all too few people in Silicon Valley are answering or even are asking, because their success has decoupled them to some extent from the fate of the rest of the country. So Thiel is a skeptic that the internet is more than a net positive but not a big one, as he put it to me, which is a shocking thing to hear from the founder of PayPal. He doesn't think the internet has done enough to raise living standards and bring broad prosperity in the same way that the earlier industrial age did. Maybe it's too soon. Maybe in the next generation we'll see the benefits. But when I hear some people in tech talking about, well, cash value is overrated, and what we really need to focus on is all the social value of technology companies, that's when I get a little bit suspicious, because it seems as if you're saying, as long as you have very cool new ways to hang out with your friends online and otherwise by mobile, you shouldn't worry too much about whether there's a job for you, because jobs are overrated. Well, tell that to Tammy Thomas in Youngstown. So that's a long way of saying there are new ideas about how society is reorganizing itself in this wide open and kind of chaotic time. I haven't seen the outlines of a convincing reorganization that actually will bring broad benefits to most of us. Any more? Yes.
So as institutions are declining that people used to rely on, what did you find? Were there any patterns in the characters of your books on what people were falling back on to do what they needed to do in their lives?
That's a great question. You're on the right track that, yes, Dean Price does not have a business association or a newspaper or a union or a local college behind him. So what he has is a very American faith in himself, handed down through different sort of folk philosophers from our past, starting with Emerson and SelfReliance. And then in Dean's case, this guy Napoleon Hill. Has anyone here heard of Napoleon Hill? Very few people have. He was like the first how to succeed in business guru in American history. And he wrote a book called The Law of Success and another book called Think and Grow Rich, which are codifications of all that he learned from Andrew Carnegie and Henry Ford and John D. Rockefeller and the titans of his age about how to he's like the Timothy Ferriss of the early 20th century. And Dean has imbibed that philosophy of if you can think it and conceive it and believe it, you can achieve it, which is also the philosophy you find on sort of pop culture figures like Oprah Winfrey, who is also one of the celebrities I profile in the book. And it's a very tenacious American idea. And I think it is especially prevalent in times when people feel the normal channels of upward mobility have been closed off. So they have to fall back on, what might be a kind of magical thinking about the powers of the mind. So that's one. I mean, religion is a key in the lives of many of the characters in my book, but not organized religion. They're not really involved, Tammy Thomas briefly, but not so involved in a particular church, but more in, again, a kind of individual faith that might, connect them to something invisible, but not necessarily to other people. There is a real aloneness to the lives of these characters, and they are very much carrying the weight of their lives by themselves. Yes?
Hi. So there's a sort of a conventional wisdom that's been around for a while that says that, first the Industrial Revolution and then the Information Revolution have sort of pushed jobs, up the educational food chain by, eliminating the need for unskilled labor, but that the sort of high skilled jobs that replace them have been even better. But then there's been sort of a counter push to that idea recently. Paul Krugman wrote an editorial recently in which he, warned about the day when computers can take over the functions of lawyers and doctors and software engineers and,
software. No, not software engineers.
Well,
you can't take that away.
Yeah, well, as they say, the singularity is coming. So
yeah, that's sort of a Peter Thiel idea too.
So I'm just wondering, where do you stand on this debate? And what do you think would happen if computers became so intelligent that none of us
that there'd be no need for us?
Yeah, basically.
No need for writers. No need for advertisers. I'd say we might as well give up.
Or does it mean that our concept of capitalism itself needs rethinking?
There you sort of get closer to the Jaron Lanier idea. I don't know if any of you know his new book, which is also a critical picture of where technology has brought the economy over the last generation. There seem to be a whole bunch of books coming out right now that are beginning to look more critically at tech, which I think is a good thing. Not that it deserves to be torn down, but it's so powerful and so successful that it needs to be scrutinized, with as much critical energy as, the oil and gas sector or the lobbying industry. You've just outlined a terrifying portrait of the future where none of us are necessary. My editor, who's here, is not necessary. None of you are. I mean, I thought at least the software engineers would be spared, just sort of running around in the ruins of, the singularity. But is that conventional wisdom or is it wisdom that you just outlined? I mean, it seems to me that is what's happened. The Industrial Revolution took away a lot of jobs and created a lot of jobs. And the jobs it created were, for a while, better jobs. We're now at a stage where a lot of those jobs have disappeared, partly because of technology. But there are some very good jobs that have been created in the ruins, and a lot of them are right here. I mean, what could be better than working for Google? You get all these benefits that are just unthinkable to people, in other industries. But there's not that many of you. Google's pretty big compared to Facebook and Twitter. So what you're suggesting is, with Moore's law, we're getting closer to the point where even Google could reduce to maybe 200, or maybe 20, or maybe 2. And then, the people at the top will continue to tell us that Moore's law is good, but the question of good for whom will be, even more pertinent. So I guess you've pretty much answered your question. No one outside of a tiny, tiny little group could be happy with the picture that you've portrayed of the future. I think there will have to be some rethinking about the idea of inevitable progress coming with technological change, which is not necessarily, an argument, but it's almost a faith that people in the tech world have, and which people outside it might, be a little more skeptical of. One more? Yeah.
In your time travel back to the late 70s, permit me to observe that that's also the era when deregulation started to appear and gain momentum and looked to many people like common sense, because they always pick the horror story, of needing 5 guys to change a light bulb at Lincoln Center or whatever the examples are always phrased as.
Right.
Do you believe that contributed to the unwinding, or do you think it's part of the unwinding's emphasis on personal choice and personal freedom? Why would I want to be regulated if my own personal freedom is the most important thing? Right.
Well, one purpose of regulation actually is to create a little barrier between you and the power of corporations, which could be called a kind of personal freedom. So I wouldn't pit regulations against freedom quite so neatly. But you're absolutely right that the late 70s, and it started under Democrats too, we forget that, in which transportation, airlines, telecommunications, oil and gas were all, the deregulation began then. In fact, Edward Kennedy was one of the main champions of deregulation. It seemed like common sense. And perhaps it was at the time, because the economy had really run up against some pretty serious contradictions. The word stagflation, which some of you might not be too familiar with, was like mortgage-backed securities back then. It was the thing, it was like the virus that we couldn't get rid of. And it seemed like deregulation and the financialization of the economy through unleashing Wall Street was the answer to that. So every answer creates a new problem. And the deunionization, which also really had its beginnings in the late 70s with the decline of manufacturing, that too, to some people, seemed like common sense. Unions were standing in the way of progress. Well, unions also created a middle class that provided a huge mass of consumers for the products that were made in this country. So for every problem you solve, you might create a new one. And now I think we've kind of run up against maybe the outer limits of maximizing freedom. There's always a balance between freedom and equality. And what we've done in the past generation is moved as far as you can get toward freedom without having society kind of flying apart at the seams. And that's what I see happening now. And yet there is this irony, which is we've also become more inclusive. I don't see why we couldn't have become more inclusive without becoming less equal. Why we couldn't have gay Boy Scouts and good public schools at the same time. Maybe time for one more question. Is there one more? Yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of the decline of manufacturing, I guess, in the U.S. correlates, I think, with the decline in the middle class, and that correlates, I think, with globalization. Do you buy into that? And if you do, should we feel bad about the relative minor decline in American standard of living when hundreds of millions of Chinese have a significantly better standard of living because of this?
Right. Well, you're asking sort of why should we care more about Americans than about other people, which is a big question. This book is very insular. It's very much focused on this country, even though it's aware of these big changes happening elsewhere. I guess I feel concerned about my country. It's like being worried about your family. You don't want it to fail. You want your children to grow up in a good place. We're not all just citizens of the world now. We still belong to certain physical places that are going to shape our future. So that's one motive for my writing the book. You're right that globalization brought benefits to a lot of people, and that there was something inevitable about it. I'm not going to fall into the trap of saying we should rewind to a period before we had instant communications around the world. It would be crazy. But what I see happening is, along with these sort of macroeconomic forces sweeping in, there have been social and even moral changes kind of coming through the back door and taking advantage of the big upheavals in the economy, which is to say our leaders' vision growing narrower and more self-centered and more willing to do what benefits them at the greater expense. An idea that used to exist in places where you wouldn't expect to find it, of having some responsibility beyond one's own most immediate interests. I don't see that very much. I don't see it in elected officials. I don't see it in former elected officials, and I don't see it in business leaders very much either. And to ask yourself, did it have to be this way? You can compare us to a country like Germany, subject to all the same forces of globalization, immigration, the pressures on manufacturing, and yet they've made decisions there that have retained that social contract among Germans that we have been willing to tear up. We decided we're going to let the landscape sort of be denuded and new things will be built. And so some new things are being built like this. But I'm concerned about the country my children are going to grow up in. And I'm not sure there'll be jobs at Google for them. So that's a long-winded answer. And I've been a little long-winded in general, but I really thank you all for your attention, and you're welcome.